What does it take to convince a human being to kill their own child? What does it take to make hundreds of people line up, in an orderly fashion, and willingly drink a poison they know will end their lives in a matter of minutes? We believe our minds are our own. We believe in free will. We believe we are immune to the power of persuasion. The story of Jonestown is a terrifying testament to how wrong we are. On November 18, 1978, in a remote, isolated jungle commune in the South American nation of Guyana, over 900 American citizens, a third of them children, died in the largest mass murder-suicide in modern history. They were not forced at gunpoint. They were led to their deaths by a single, charismatic man they called Father. This is the true story of Jim Jones and the People's Temple. It is more than just the story of a cult. It is a deep, psychological autopsy of the mechanisms of belief, the anatomy of manipulation, and the terrifying power of a single human voice to lead an entire community into an abyss from which there was no return. Before the poison, there was the promise. Before the jungle commune, there was a dream of a better world. To understand the nightmare of Jonestown, we must first understand the utopian vision that gave it birth, and the charismatic, complicated man who was its architect, James Warren Jones. The People's Temple did not begin as a cult. In the 1950s and 60s, at the height of the American Civil Rights Movement and the social upheaval of the era, the temple was seen by many as a progressive and radical force for good. Jim Jones was a fiery young preacher from Indiana who preached a powerful and seductive message of racial equality and social justice. In a deeply segregated America, his church was a startling anomaly. It was one of the first fully integrated congregations in the country, a place where black and white families worshipped, ate, and lived together as equals. For his followers, many of whom were marginalized, impoverished, or disenfranchised, the People's Temple was more than just a church. It was a sanctuary. It was a family. Jones offered them not just spiritual salvation, but a tangible, practical paradise on earth. He ran soup kitchens, provided housing for the homeless, and created a powerful sense of community and belonging for people who had been cast aside by society. From a psychological perspective, Jones was a master of manipulation from the very beginning. He understood the deep human need for purpose, for community, and for a charismatic leader who promises simple answers to complex problems. He performed elaborate, staged miracle healings where he would seemingly cure cancer and other ailments, building a reputation as a living prophet with a direct line to God. For his followers, the evidence was right before their eyes. He was a man who could do the impossible. But beneath the surface of this utopian project, a darker, more sinister psychological dynamic was at play. Jones did not just want to help his followers, he wanted to own them. He slowly and methodically began to isolate them from the outside world. He encouraged them to sever ties with their families, who he labeled as enemies of the cause. He demanded that they donate their life savings and their homes to the temple, creating a state of total financial dependence. He was deconstructing their old identities and rebuilding them around a single, central pillar, himself. He was no longer just their preacher, he was their father, their provider, their savior. He was the source of all their hope and the sole arbiter of their reality. The seeds of Jonestown were not planted in the jungles of Guyana, but in the minds of his followers, years before. In the quiet towns of Indiana and California, he had built a church, but its true foundation was a carefully constructed architecture of absolute psychological control. By the 1970s, the People's Temple had moved its headquarters to San Francisco, where Jim Jones transformed his church into a formidable political machine. He could mobilize thousands of dedicated, disciplined followers at a moment's notice, making him a powerful and courted figure in California politics. He was seen as a progressive leader, a man who could get things done, but behind the public facade of political activism and social good, Jones's private kingdom was becoming a dark and terrifying place. His control over his followers was now absolute. He preached that the outside world, which he called the system, was a corrupt, racist, and apocalyptic nightmare, doomed to imminent nuclear destruction. The temple, he claimed, was the only ark, the only safe place on earth. This constant us versus them narrative is a classic and powerful tool of cult indoctrination. By creating an external enemy, Jones deepened his followers' dependence on him and justified the extreme measures he was about to take. Paranoia became the air they breathed. Within the temple, dissent was no longer tolerated. Members were encouraged, and later forced, to inform on one another. Children were taught to spy on their parents. Friendships and family bonds were systematically broken and replaced by a single, unwavering loyalty to Father. Jones used a brutal combination of public humiliation, sleep deprivation, and physical abuse to enforce his will. Those who stepped out of line were subjected to punishing catharsis sessions, where they would be verbally and physically assaulted by the entire community. A psychological technique designed to crush the individual ego and enforce total conformity. It was during this time that Jones unveiled his final, grandiose vision, a promised land. He told his followers they would leave the corrupt United States behind and build a true socialist paradise, an agricultural utopia in the remote jungles of Guyana on the coast of South America. He called it the People's Temple Agricultural Project. The world would come to know it by a simpler, more infamous name, Jonestown. In 1977, the exodus began. Over 900 people, from newborn babies to elderly pensioners, sold everything they owned, signed over their passports and social security checks to the temple, and followed their leader into the dense, unfamiliar jungle. They were not just moving to a new country, they were leaving the known world behind. From a psychological perspective, this physical isolation was the final and most critical step in Jones's plan for total control. In California, his followers were still exposed to the outside world, to skeptical family members, to critical news reports. In the remote jungle of Guyana, 100 miles from the nearest town, he would have them completely to himself. There would be no dissenting voices, no outside influences, no escape. He would become their entire reality. The first photographs and promotional videos from Jonestown looked like a dream come true. They showed a vibrant, bustling community, black and white people working together, carving a paradise out of the wilderness. They built cottages, a school, a sawmill, a communal dining pavilion. It was, on the surface, the culmination of everything Jones had ever promised. But this utopian image was a carefully constructed lie, a piece of propaganda designed to hide a dark and rapidly deteriorating reality. The dream of a jungle paradise was about to descend into a nightmare of imprisonment, paranoia, and psychological terror from which almost no one would return. The paradise promised in the heart of the Guyanese jungle was a carefully constructed illusion. For the 900 members of the People's Temple who had made the exodus, the reality of Jonestown was not a utopia. It was a psychological prison, meticulously designed for total control. The physical isolation was now absolute. Cut off from the world by hundreds of miles of dense, impenetrable jungle, with their passports confiscated and their communications monitored, they were completely at the mercy of one man, Jim Jones. Life in Jonestown was a grueling routine of hard labor and slow starvation. The dream of a self-sufficient agricultural commune quickly withered under the harsh realities of the jungle soil and the community's lack of farming expertise. The diet consisted of little more than rice and beans, leading to widespread malnutrition. The followers worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, their bodies growing weaker as their spirits were systematically broken. But the most powerful tool of control was not the physical hardship, it was the psychological warfare waged by Jones himself. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter of the settlement, not to protect the residents from the dangers of the jungle, but to prevent them from escaping. Every aspect of their lives was controlled. Their mail was censored, their conversations were monitored, and they were subjected to endless propaganda broadcast over the settlement's loudspeaker system. Day and night, the voice of Jim Jones echoed through the camp, a constant, inescapable presence in their minds, delivering sermons, issuing commands, and spinning a paranoid narrative of a world that was conspiring to destroy them. It was in this atmosphere of total isolation and control that Jones introduced the most terrifying ritual of Jonestown, a psychological tool of such profound horror that it would ultimately pave the way for the final massacre. He called them the White Knights. Visuals show a cinematic recreation of the community gathering in the central pavilion at night. The faces are filled with fear and exhaustion. The sound of an alarm siren is heard faintly in the background. Voiceover. In the middle of the night, a siren would wail across the compound, and every man, woman, and child would be ordered to assemble at the central pavilion. There, under the dim lights, Jones, his mind and body now ravaged by drug abuse, would deliver a rambling, paranoid sermon. He would tell them that their enemies, the CIA, the capitalists, the racist forces of America were closing in, that they were about to be invaded, and that their paradise was about to be destroyed. He would then announce that the time had come for a revolutionary suicide, an act of defiance against a corrupt world. He told them that death was preferable to being captured, that it was the only honorable way out. Armed guards would move through the crowd, distributing small cups of a red liquid. Jones would tell them it was poison. He would command them to drink it, to give it to their children, to prove their loyalty to the cause. Imagine the absolute terror of that moment, the weeping of children, the desperate, fearful glances between family members. But to refuse was to be branded a traitor, an enemy of the people, a fate that was often worse than death itself. One by one, they would drink, and then they would wait to die. After a long, agonizing period of silence and terror, Jones would reveal the truth. "It was a drill," he would announce. "A test of your loyalty. You have passed." The relief that washed over the crowd was immense, but it was a relief that left a permanent scar. From a psychological perspective, these white knight drills were a masterstroke of manipulation. They served three critical purposes. First, they were a loyalty test, a way for Jones to identify and weed out anyone who still possessed a shred of individual will. Second, they were a tool of desensitization. By repeatedly rehearsing the act of suicide, Jones was normalizing the unthinkable. He was transforming the most primal human instinct of will to live into an act of betrayal, and the act of self-destruction into the ultimate expression of faith. Finally, and most importantly, the drills were a form of reality control. In the isolated world of Jonestown, Jim Jones was the only source of information. The White Knights proved to his followers again and again that he held the power of life and death in his hands. He was their god, and it was this carefully cultivated absolute power that would set the stage for the final, tragic act of his dark ministry. While Jim Jones was building his isolated kingdom of fear in the jungle, the world outside had not entirely forgotten about the 900 American citizens he had taken with him. Back in the United States, a small but increasingly desperate group of former temple members and concerned relatives were trying to sound the alarm. They told horrifying stories of physical and psychological abuse, of families being torn apart, and of their loved ones being held against their will. They called themselves the concerned relatives. For months their pleas to the government were met with bureaucratic indifference, but they finally found a champion in a charismatic and fearless California congressman named Leo Ryan. Ryan was a man known for his hands-on approach to investigation. He was not a typical politician. He had once had himself smuggled into Folsom Prison to investigate conditions there. When the stories of abuse in Jonestown reached his office, he saw it as his duty to find out the truth for himself. In November of 1978, against the advice of the State Department, Ryan announced he would lead a fact-finding mission to Jonestown, bringing with him a delegation of journalists and some of the concerned relatives. For Jim Jones, this visit was a direct threat to his absolute control. It was the outside world attempting to breach the walls of his carefully constructed reality, but he also saw it as an opportunity. He agreed to the visit, confident that he could stage a performance so convincing that Ryan would return to America and declare Jonestown a paradise, silencing his critics forever. On November 17, 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan and his delegation arrived at the Port Katima airstrip, a small dirt runway carved out of the jungle, and were then taken by truck to Jonestown. What they found, at first, seemed to be a perfect utopia. As they entered the settlement, they were greeted by a joyous, cheering crowd of hundreds of residents. The community was clean, organized, and filled with the sounds of happy, singing children. They were treated to a grand feast, and a musical performance in the central pavilion. The residents Ryan spoke to seemed happy, healthy, and deeply devoted to their leader. The performance was flawless. But as the night wore on, the carefully constructed facade began to crack. While the music played and Jones delivered a charismatic speech, a member of the press corps, NBC correspondent Don Harris, was secretly passed a small, folded piece of paper by a temple member. The note read, "Please help us get out of Jonestown." This was the first breach in the wall. Soon, another temple member secretly confirmed the stories of abuse and imprisonment. They told Ryan that people were terrified, that they were being held against their will, and that they wanted to leave. The utopian dream was a lie. Ryan, now understanding the true, horrifying nature of the situation, made a courageous and fateful decision. The next morning, on November 18th, as the delegation prepared to leave, Congressman Ryan stood before the assembled community and made a public announcement. He declared that if anyone wished to leave Jonestown and return to the United States with him, he would grant them safe passage. It was a moment of profound, terrifying tension. For the residents, it was the first real offer of escape they had ever received. But to accept it was to commit an act of ultimate betrayal against Jim Jones, in his very presence. For a long moment, there was silence. And then, one person, a woman named Patricia Parks, bravely stepped forward with her family, then another, and another. In the end, 16 temple members chose to defect. to leave the paradise behind and accept the congressman's offer of freedom. Jim Jones watched this unfold, his face a mask of cold, barely contained fury. The performance was over. His perfect, controlled world was unraveling before his very eyes. The ultimate act of defiance had been committed, and he knew he could not let it go unpunished. The departure of 16 people was not just a defection, it was a crack in the foundation of his entire reality, a crack that threatened to bring the whole dark edifice crashing down. As Congressman Ryan and the small group of defectors prepared to leave for the airstrip, a chain of events was set in motion that would lead, in a matter of hours, to a horrifying and bloody conclusion. Congressman Leo Ryan, the man who had come to investigate and to save lives, was cut down in a hail of bullets, becoming the only U.S. congressman ever to be assassinated in the line of duty. 3 journalists, including NBC correspondent Don Harris and photographer Greg Robinson, were also murdered as they tried to document the atrocity. A brave defector, Patricia Parks, was killed. 11 others were wounded in the chaos, left bleeding on the remote airstrip as the attackers, their grim work done, climbed back onto the tractor and sped back towards Jonestown. From a psychological perspective, the airstrip massacre was the point of no return. It was the final irrevocable act that severed Jonestown's last remaining tie to the outside world. By murdering a United States congressman, Jim Jones knew he had crossed a line. There would be no more negotiations, no more propaganda, no more chances to salvage his reputation. The full, unstoppable force of the US government would now descend upon his isolated jungle paradise. The US versus them narrative he had been preaching for years was no longer a paranoid fantasy. He had just made it a reality. His followers' greatest fear that the outside world was coming to destroy them was now about to come true. Precisely because of his own violent actions, the trap was now sprung. For the hundreds of followers back in Jonestown, there was no longer any hope of a peaceful resolution. Their father had just declared war on the most powerful nation on earth. Their fate was now inextricably tied to his. They were trapped not just by the jungle, but by the horrific act of violence that had been committed in their name. As the news of the massacre at the airstrip reached the central pavilion, a grim and final message began to echo from the settlement's loudspeakers. It was the voice of Jim Jones, calling his family together for one last, final meeting. The White Nights, which had once been terrifying rehearsals, were over. Tonight was the opening, and final, performance. What followed was not an act of mass suicide. It was a methodical, efficient, and horrifyingly organized mass murder, orchestrated by Jim Jones and executed by his most loyal followers. The death tape is a haunting, real-time document of this process. The first to die were the most innocent. Jones gave the order. The parents and nurses were instructed to bring the babies and children forward first. Syringes, stripped of their needles, were used to squirt the grape-flavored cyanide mixture down the throats of the infants. On the tape you can hear the sounds clearly. The crying of the children, the wails of mothers forced to participate in the murder of their own babies, and the calm, reassuring, almost hypnotic voice of Jim Jones speaking over the chaos. It's not a thing to cry about, his voice coos, as a child screams in the background. This is a revolutionary act. They are not crying from pain, it's just a little bitter tasting. This is the absolute apex of psychological control. Jones is actively reframing the reality of murder into an act of love and mercy. He is telling his followers that the sounds of their children dying are not sounds of terror, but of transition to a better place. For a parent, the act of poisoning one's own child is the ultimate violation of every natural instinct. The fact that hundreds of parents in Jonestown complied is a chilling testament to the years of psychological conditioning they had endured. Their identity as individuals, as mothers and fathers, had been completely erased and replaced by their identity as loyal followers of the temple. Their primary duty was no longer to their children, but to him. After the children were dead, the adults were instructed to line up. One by one, they approached the vat, were handed a paper cup of the purple liquid, and were told to drink. We must conduct a psychological autopsy on this final, terrible act of compliance. Why didn't they fight back? A few did. On the tape, you can hear the sounds of struggle, the screams of those who refused. They were likely held down by the armed guards and injected with the poison. But the vast majority, hundreds of people, went to their deaths with a strange, passive resignation. This was not a sudden decision. It was a final, logical step in a journey of de-individuation that had been going on for years. First, Jones had isolated them from their families and the outside world. Then, he had stripped them of their financial independence and their personal identities. Finally, through the terrifying white night rehearsals, he had desensitized them to the very idea of death itself. He had systematically dismantled every psychological defense they possessed, leaving them with only one guiding principle: loyalty to father. In their exhausted, malnourished, and brainwashed state, for many, the thought of defying Jones was more terrifying than the thought of dying. Death, as Jones had promised them, was simply a peaceful rest, a welcome escape from a world he had taught them to fear. As the poison took hold, a grim and horrifying scene unfolded in the pavilion. The cyanide caused a quick, agonizing death, with victims collapsing in convulsions within minutes. The entire process took less than an hour. The living were forced to step over the bodies of the dead to get their own cup of poison. At the center of it all, sitting on his wicker throne, was Jim Jones. He did not drink the poison. As his family died at his feet, he continued to speak into the microphone, his voice a rambling, self-pitying monologue. He was the director, the author, the god of this dark, final act. And when it was over, when the last of his followers had fallen silent, he chose a different end for himself. Jim Jones died not from the poison he had forced upon his children, but from a single, self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He was a coward to the very end. In the hours following the massacre at the airstrip, a handful of survivors, including some of the wounded journalists, had managed to escape into the dense jungle. They spent a terrifying night hiding, listening to the distant sounds of gunfire and the final, haunting sermon broadcast over the Jonestown loudspeaker. When dawn broke on November 19, 1978, the first units of the Guyanese army began to arrive at the settlement. They were expecting to find a hostile, armed camp. They were prepared for a firefight. They were not prepared for what they actually found. The scene that greeted them was one of profound, absolute, and unnatural silence. There were no gunshots, no screams, no signs of life. The entire compound was eerily still. As the soldiers cautiously made their way towards the central pavilion, they were met with a sight of such apocalyptic horror that it was almost impossible for the human mind to comprehend. It was a sea of blood, hundreds upon hundreds of men, women, and children, lying face down in the mud, their arms wrapped around each other in a final, tragic embrace. The bright colors of their clothing created a surreal and grotesque carpet of death. The air was thick with the sweet, sickening smell of cyanide and decay. It was a scene of mass death on a scale that was unimaginable outside of a major war or a natural disaster. The initial reports that came back to the capital, Georgetown, were so unbelievable that they were initially dismissed as an exaggeration. When the American authorities and the international press arrived, the full, horrifying scale of the tragedy became clear. The final body count was 918. Of those, over 300 were children. It was the single largest loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until the attacks of September 11, 2001. The task of identifying and processing the scene was a logistical and psychological nightmare. The humid jungle heat was accelerating the decomposition of the bodies, creating a gruesome and hazardous environment. For the young soldiers and officials tasked with this grim work, it was a descent into a hell they would never forget. As investigators began to piece together the final moments, the initial narrative of a mass suicide began to crumble, replaced by a far more sinister truth. They found evidence of coercion. Syringes were found scattered on the ground. Autopsies on some of the victims showed that they had been injected with poison against their will. The bodies of the children, who were too young to have made a conscious choice, were a testament to the fact that this was not a simple act of collective free will. This is a critical part of our psychological autopsy. To label Jonestown as a mass suicide is to grant a final, posthumous victory to Jim Jones. It validates his narrative that this was a noble, revolutionary act. The truth is far more complex and far more disturbing. It was a mass murder. A small core group of loyal fanatics, acting on the direct orders of their leader, murdered the children and the few who resisted. The vast majority of the adults, in a state of exhaustion, fear, and profound psychological brainwashing, then willingly walked to their own deaths. It was a testament to the terrifying power of a cult leader to completely dismantle the human instinct for survival. The world watched in horrified fascination as the images from Jonestown were broadcast across the globe. How could this have happened? How could so many American citizens be led to such a dark and horrifying end? The story of the People's Temple, once a symbol of progressive hope, had become a byword for the darkest and most dangerous aspects of blind faith and charismatic manipulation. The promised paradise had revealed itself to be a factory for death, and the world was now left to grapple with the terrible, unanswered questions it left behind. The horror of Jonestown is not in the number of the dead. It is in the chilling question of how. How does a single man convince 900 people to abandon their reality, their families, and their most primal instinct for survival? To answer this, we must dissect the very anatomy of a cult, and the terrifyingly effective psychological techniques that Jim Jones mastered. This was not random madness, it was a carefully engineered system of mind control. The first and most powerful tool was isolation. This is the cornerstone of every cult. Jones understood that to control a person's reality, you must first become their only reality. He did this in stages. First, he created a powerful, loving community that met all the social and emotional needs of its members, making the outside world seem cold and unnecessary. Then, he began to actively sever their external ties, labeling friends and family who expressed concern as enemies or traitors. Finally, the exodus to the Guyanese jungle was the ultimate act of physical and informational isolation. In Jonestown, there was no outside news, no dissenting opinions, no one to tell them that their reality was not the only one. He had created a closed psychological ecosystem. The second tool was the creation of a charismatic authority. Jim Jones was not just a leader, he presented himself as a messianic, almost divine figure. He performed staged miracle healings and offered simple, powerful answers to life's most complex problems. This created a dynamic of absolute dependency. In a world that felt chaotic and unjust, he was the single source of truth, hope, and salvation. This is a powerful psychological hook. The human brain is wired to seek out and follow strong, confident leaders, especially in times of uncertainty. Jones exploited this fundamental human need to its absolute limit. The third and most insidious tool was the systematic breakdown of the individual ego. A person with a strong sense of self is difficult to control. Jones's methods were designed to systematically dismantle personal identity. Sleep deprivation from endless sermons, public humiliation sessions for minor infractions, and the culture of forcing members to inform on one another all served to erode a person's self-worth and critical thinking. The individual was taught that their own thoughts and feelings were selfish and untrustworthy, and that the only good thoughts were those that aligned with the group and with Father. Finally, Jones used the powerful psychological principle of escalating commitment. He did not ask for the ultimate sacrifice on the first day. He started with small requests: attend church, donate a small amount of money, volunteer your time. Then the requests grew larger: sell your house, give the temple your life savings, sever ties with your family, move to the jungle. With each step, the follower became more heavily invested, making it psychologically harder to turn back. By the time the final request came to drink the poison, they had already made 1,000 smaller sacrifices. For many, it was simply the last, logical step in a journey they had been on for years. These were not weak or foolish people. They were idealists, doctors, lawyers, and ordinary families searching for a better world. but they were subjected to a deliberate and powerful system of psychological manipulation that preyed on their deepest hopes and fears. Jim Jones did not use magic. He used a textbook formula of psychological warfare, a formula that took a group of hopeful idealists and slowly, methodically, transformed them into the willing participants of their own destruction. The bodies were eventually removed from the jungle floor. The makeshift settlement was reclaimed by the wilderness, and the name Jonestown became a permanent scar on the 20th century. In the immediate aftermath, the world reacted with a mixture of horrified fascination and a desperate need to distance itself. The victims were often dismissed as crazy cultists, a strange and alien group whose fate could never befall the rest of us. This is a common psychological defense mechanism. By labeling the victims as other, we create a comforting illusion of immunity. But the true dread of Jonestown is not its strangeness. It is its familiarity. The story is not an aberration of human history. It is an extreme and horrifying manifestation of psychological principles that are at play all around us, every single day. The shadow of Jonestown is long, and it stretches into the very heart of our modern world. The techniques that Jim Jones used to control his followers were not supernatural. They were a masterclass in the science of persuasion and manipulation, the charismatic authority, the isolation, the us versus them mentality, the creation of an external enemy, the demand for absolute loyalty. This is not just the blueprint for a cult. It is a blueprint for any form of political or social extremism. We see the echo of Jones's voice in the modern political demagogue, who promises simple solutions to complex problems, who labels all critics as enemies of the people, and who demands unquestioning faith from their followers. We see the informational isolation of Jonestown recreated in the digital echo chambers of social media, where algorithms feed us a constant stream of content that confirms our existing beliefs, slowly and invisibly cutting us off from any dissenting point of view, until the leader's narrative becomes our only reality. The White Night rehearsals, where the act of suicide was normalized, have their modern equivalent in the way online communities can normalize extreme and dangerous ideologies. Within these digital bubbles, radical ideas are repeated and validated until they are no longer seen as radical, but as a noble and necessary truth. The psychological distance between a follower drinking poison for a cause and a modern extremist committing an act of violence for an ideology can be terrifyingly small. The story of Jonestown is a permanent and vital warning. It is a testament to the fact that the human need to believe, the need for community, and the need for a sense of purpose are among the most powerful forces in our nature. They can lead us to create art, to build nations, and to perform acts of incredible love. But as the tragedy of the People's Temple proves, these same noble instincts, when hijacked by a charismatic and manipulative leader, can be twisted into a weapon of profound and absolute destruction. It teaches us that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who announce themselves with horns and a pitchfork. They are the ones who come to us with a smile, offering a hand in friendship, promising a paradise, and speaking the language of hope. The ultimate lesson of Jonestown is a call for a constant, vigilant, and critical examination of our own beliefs, our own leaders, and our own profound need to belong. Because the line between a community and a cult, between a savior and a tyrant, is often thinner than we dare to imagine. The jungle has reclaimed the land where Jonestown once stood. The wooden pavilion has rotted away, the cottages have collapsed, and the ground that was once soaked with poison and tragedy is now covered in a thick, green blanket of life. Nature has erased the physical scar, but the psychological scar, the one that Jonestown left on the world's consciousness, has not faded. The story of the People's Temple is a dark and complex labyrinth, but at its center there is not a monster or a demon. There is a mirror, and when we look into it, we are forced to see a reflection of ourselves. The story's enduring dread comes not from its strangeness, but from its terrifying familiarity. It is a perfect, horrifying anatomy of one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in the human experience: belief. We often think of belief as a conscious choice, a rational decision we make based on evidence. The story of Jonestown proves that this is a dangerous illusion. It teaches us that belief is a deep, primal, and often irrational human need. We are social creatures, wired to seek community, to follow leaders, and to find meaning in a chaotic world. Jim Jones did not create this need, he exploited it. He understood that if you can provide someone with a powerful enough sense of belonging, you can begin to control their sense of reality. If you can give them a noble purpose, you can ask them to make unimaginable sacrifices. And if you can become their only source of hope, you can lead them into the darkest abyss. The lesson of Jonestown is not to be wary of cults. It is to be wary of the conditions that create them. It is to be wary of charismatic leaders who promise perfect utopias and simple answers to complex problems. It is a call for a profound and sometimes painful It asks us to examine our own beliefs, our own groups, and our own leaders, and to ask a difficult question. Does my community encourage critical thinking, or does it demand blind faith? Does my leader invite questions, or do they punish dissent? The final, chilling truth is that the seeds of a Jonestown exist wherever a vulnerable population is met by a charismatic manipulator with a utopian promise. The tools have changed. The isolated jungle commune has been replaced by the digital echo chamber, but the fundamental psychology remains the same. And so, we are left with our final call to action. This is not a call to action against some external enemy. It is a call for an internal one. The greatest defense against the Jim Joneses of the world is a strong and independent mind. It is the courage to ask difficult questions, the humility to admit when we might be wrong, and the empathy to listen to those who disagree with us. In the comments below, let's start a discussion. What do you believe is the single most important lesson from the tragedy of Jonestown? By dissecting the anatomy of this dark belief, we can better arm ourselves against the phantoms of manipulation that still haunt our modern world.